We there was a guy, I went to one congregation where this guy never came to Bible class except for the Sunday when the clocks changed because he didn't know. He thought it was an hour later. And they always say, you get an extra hour today, but we woke up earlier than we normally would have anyway. Like, not only did we not wake up at the normal, like, we woke up early. I don't know why that was the case. Even for the daylight savings time, we woke up early. So, yeah, there you go. All right, but it's good to see everybody. Let's start with a prayer, and we're going to ask Mike Scott to lead that prayer, and then we'll get into our class. Amen. I thought it appropriate to ask Mike to do that since he is the deacon of missions, and we are now in a missions class. Are you, whoop. Okay, I can't see. That monitor is not on, if that's what you're checking. You didn't know what? Oh, he's the deacon of mission work and light bulbs. He's in charge of changing light bulbs, so you see a light bulb out, tell him. We are going to do a missions class this month. We're missing half of our picture, but that's okay. And hopefully that'll brighten up here in a minute. I'm not good at PowerPoint. I'm very bad at making slides that people can see. I think it has something to do with my color vision, but maybe also just that I'm not, I don't know, just not a talent of mine. Okay, but we are going to be talking about missions for the next few weeks. I have a workbook that I'm working on for you. It's not completed yet because I've only had a couple of weeks to work on it and have some other things I'm also working on. I hope to get that to you next Sunday, but maybe the Sunday after that at the very latest. And then we won't have to fool with PowerPoint at all. We're going to cover a lot of different topics in this class, and we're going to take our time with it. Hopefully, we will learn a little bit about mission work. We're going to talk first just some of the objectives I have for the class. First of all, just to make everybody familiar with the biblical authority and background for missions. We'll start talking about that today. But I want you to understand and know just where in the Bible it talks about mission work and what it says about it and how to go about doing it from the Bible. To be familiar with different philosophies and methods when it comes to mission work. There's a lot of different ideas about how to do mission work. And the Bible, while it gives us authority to do mission work and it gives us some guidelines on how to do it, it doesn't get down to this is the exact way to do everything involved in mission work. So there's some ideas that people have, and we'll look at some of those, some that I agree with, some that I don't agree with. And we'll get into those here in the coming weeks. One thing I want is for you to learn what mission work is, what it actually means, and what it is like to be a missionary. And that's not necessarily the easiest thing to explain. Just last Sunday, I was at Troy's house, and we were talking about being missionaries. And one of the hardest questions to answer, and you get this a lot, as a missionary is, what is your typical day like? And the reason that's so hard is there's just not a typical day on the mission field, at least not that I've ever experienced. But just kind of get some idea of what that is like and how you have to learn to be very flexible in doing mission work. Another, to become familiar with the ideas and reasoning behind indigenous methods. That's going to be one of our main focuses. If you've been a member of this congregation for any length of time, you are probably familiar with that terminology. but we're going to get right down into it, find out exactly what that means and why it is something we are interested in doing. Now, this is probably my main objective, is to develop a further interest in involvement in missions. Now, whether that's in supporting more missionaries as an individual, being involved in more mission works as a congregation, or going on mission trips. That's one thing I would love. If you've never been on a mission trip, but after this class you want to go on one, that would be great. And if you would like to become involved in full-time missions, maybe you might have a career already going, but maybe you just think, you know what, this is something I could do. I know Troy is 75 years old now. No, that's not right. No, he's, I won't tell how old Troy is, but he and Andrea were in their 40s, I think, when he went to preaching school. I was in my late 20s. And he had a career, Andrea had a career, and they left it to go to preaching school. And I think, Troy, correct me if I'm wrong. By the way, I'll interact a lot with Troy in this class, but did you go to preaching school to be a missionary? Or did you go thinking you would wind up being a located preacher, and then you went, okay. Kind of came up during that time. Okay. I went to preaching school to be a missionary. Not that I would not be a Troy, a pulpit minister, or whatever you call that, but that has never really been where my interest lies. My interest has always been in going and starting churches or working with weak churches. And I was in my late 20s. I had a career going. I worked with a company that no longer exists. They've been bought out by somebody else, but I was in upper management with them and made a really good money. Rebecca likes to tell people Scott made money before he met me. But I also spent really good money, too, at that time. But anyway, left that career, and I've never, ever regretted it, not for 1 second. I'm sure Troy would say he has not either. So maybe, if you have an interest in that, we can get you involved in mission work on a full-time basis. It's a great, great way to work for the Lord and to make a living. It can be difficult at times, but it's definitely worth all the difficulty, at least in my mind. So now we're going to do something really quick. We're going to do a quick mission work true-false test. Now, this is not going to count towards your final grade in this class, which you won't have anyway. Everybody passed already. But just to kind of get some ideas out there and to just see where people think about mission work, there's about 20 questions. We'll go through them quickly. Okay, number one, true or false, and you can just call out the answer or not, I don't know. The words missionary, missions, or mission are found in the New Testament. Is that true or false? What do you think? True? True? Troy, what do you think? False. False. Those are not found in the English New Testament. Okay, that is false. The words missionary and missions are not found in the New Testament. We're going to talk about that here in just a little while. Every one of these questions we'll wind up covering in our class at some point down the line. This one we'll cover today if we can get to it. Okay, here's another one, true or false. Paul and Barnabas were the first missionaries in the Bible. What do you think about that, true or false? False. I've got a lot of false. Don't worry, if you get it wrong, we'll just laugh at you, so feel free to call it out, okay? No. False. Paul and Barnabas were not the first ones sent out to do mission work. We might talk about that today. If not, we'll get to it next week, is next week Upkeek or the week after next? Week after. That's right. Okay. If I had read my bulletin, I would know that. Okay. This one might be harder to answer. Paul and Barnabas' missionary journeys took just a few months each. False. False. We're going to look at that, hopefully, again next week. But while we're just here on this question, this is actually a very, very important thing to understand when it comes to missionary philosophy. There's an idea, and it's a good idea, but sometimes the way that it is presented is bad. And that idea is the Pauline method. Pauline, normally a woman's name, but also in biblical terms, it's anything having to deal with Paul. Where the idea is you go into a place, you spend just a few weeks there, you establish the church, and then you leave. and then leave them on their own to develop, which is sort of sounds like a good idea, but it's actually can be a recipe for disaster. And we'll talk about that here in either next week or the week after. But Paul and Barnabas' missionary journeys probably took a lot longer than we sometimes think. Missionaries in the New Testament never spent long in one place. True or false? False. And again, that kind of goes along with that last one. You're probably sensing a pattern in these questions, by the way. Okay, here's one. Short-term missions are always more effective than long-term missions. What would you say, true or false? False. I would say that's probably false. Anytime when you have an absolute like that, in this case, it's probably going to be wrong. Long-term missions are always, watch that key word there, more effective than short-term. That's probably also false. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. It just depends on the mission. We're going to talk about the effectiveness of short and long-term missions in the coming weeks of this class. Now, Troy, just while I'm thinking about it, upkeep, we will not have this class during upkeep, or will we? That is correct. Okay. All right. It is next week. Yeah. Okay. It's not next Sunday. Right. But it is next week. Yeah. True or false? Upkeep is next week. So yeah, it is next week, but not next Sunday. It's the following Sunday will be upkeep week, is what I was getting at. All right. Missionary success is 100% dependent on baptisms. What do you think about that? You think that's true or false? False. False. I'm glad to hear you say false. Now, probably just because you know that all the answers are going to be false. But no, you might have also thought that. And we'll talk about that here as we move on. Missionaries in the New Testament were never supported financially by the church. Is that true or false? That's false. That's definitely false. Now, what about, just while we're thinking about it, we'll have a full class on it. But Paul, what did Paul do besides preach? What did Paul do? Do you know? He made tents. He was a tent maker. And in some places, he refused to accept money from anybody involved with the church in order so that they couldn't say anything against him. But we read in Philippians that Paul actually did accept support from the brethren in Philippi. But for the most part, he was a tent maker. We'll talk about tent-making missions in a little while. Financial support is the only way a sending church should support a missionary. What would you say? False. False. There's a lot more to it than just finance. In fact, if Margaret Street were only interested in supplying financial support to us, we would not be here right now. We would have gone with a different overseeing congregation because we want a lot more than just money. There's a lot more to it than that. Missionaries work independent of an eldership. What do you think of that? False. False. Now, there are some who think that they do, but no, they don't. We'll just very briefly give you just a Reader's Digest version right now. We believe, Rebecca and Scott believe, that this work that we're doing, that we're going to Italy, is not our work. It's Margaret Street's work. And the elders are meant to be very involved in that. We don't make big decisions on our own. Now, we have to be free to make some decisions, but a lot of decisions involved in the work belong to the elders. Okay. Something just really quick while we are also on this topic. Now, James tells us not to be many teachers, right? He says to basically think about it before you become a teacher. Why do you think that is? Why do you think James would tell us to be cautious, we'll just say it that way, about becoming teachers? Why do you think he would say that? You have a greater responsibility because you're responsible not only for yourself, but also for what you teach, right? Now, what about elders? What kind of responsibility do they have? Mike said, elders, as a preacher, I will be responsible for what I teach, but elders, I will not give an account for anybody else's soul, but elders will. And that, to me, that puts the hairs on the back of my neck and makes them stand up. Because that's just a scary thought. And I like to tell people that all the time. The elders have the full responsibility, not me. So I am always willing, unless there's some doctrinal error or some sin, to submit to the eldership, because they're the ones that give an account for other people's souls, not me. This is a good one. Margaret Street always hires the best-looking missionaries. What do you think about that? That one's true. I think that one is true. I would say definitely the best-looking missionary wives, right? I think Rebecca definitely agrees with that one, but that one was just a little bit silly. There is no such thing as culture shock, true or false? That's definitely false. Now, culture shock might not be what you think it is. It wasn't what I thought it was. Until I experienced it, I learned what it is, but we'll talk about that in the future. Here's another good one. Missionaries who struggle with culture shock are babies and need to come home, right? No, we all do. We all do struggle with it. Again, it might not be 100% the way you think you struggle with it. When I kind of came up with what I thought culture shock was based on just the words. I thought, you go someplace, you see something in the culture, and it shocks you. But that's really not what it is. Rebecca and I, when we were in Pohnpei, there was a channel that was put out by a group there called Micronesian Seminar. They were a group of Catholics, and they had all sorts of different videos, and one of them dealt with living in a foreign country. And we were just watching it, it just piqued our interest, and this guy started talking about how when you're living in a foreign country, there's so many little differences, and they build up, and they're little frustrations, and they just build up and build up and build up until you just want to strangle somebody. And we were suffering it at the time, and we had no idea that that's what was bothering us, was just the little bitty differences. And I'll just give you an example now. We'll talk about it again later. But in Pohnpei, when you went to the grocery store, first of all, you may not know this, but little old Pohnpeian women are in charge of the entire universe. You probably didn't know that, but they are. And when you go to a grocery store in Pohnpei and you've got your groceries and you're in line, you might be two people back. You're not going to stay two people back. There's an old lady who's going to get in front of you at some point, and she's going to drop her groceries down. She's going to see the total. She's going to go wait and go back, and she's going to keep getting stuff until she has all her money spent, and you just have to sit there and wait. And then you get up to the front, and you finally get your groceries rung up, and the cashier finishes ringing up your groceries, and then she looks at you like this. And then you look at her like, how much do I owe you? Because you can't see it unless you go like this and look at the cash register. But she expects you to go like that and look at the cash register. Now you think that that's not really a big deal, but it's a huge deal when it's all the time and it's so different. And that's really what culture shock is. But we'll talk about that again later. And if they are babies who need to come home, there would be no missionaries on the field. Here's one. Missionaries must accept and participate in every aspect of the host culture. What do you think about that? No, that's false. That is false. What would be not, you don't have to come up with a specific, but what would be a reason we wouldn't want to participate in everything? Might not be scriptural. I think it might be sinful, right? What's that? Well, raw food, yeah, I do eat raw food. Fish anyway. But I was thinking about like mission work in Jamaica. Is it Palm Beach Lakes that used to, were they in the Bahamas kind of heavily, or Jamaica? The Bahamas. Okay, I knew it was one or the other. But in Jamaica, right, Jamaicans are kind of known for a certain activity. It's a stereotype, but a lot of Jamaicans smoke marijuana. So if we go there, and that's part of a culture we're working with in Jamaica, should we smoke marijuana? No, we shouldn't. So that would be something we wouldn't want to participate in. Okay. Now, a successful missionary changes the culture of the host country. What do you think about that? No, that's not true either, because there are some things you can participate in, and you should encourage, and you shouldn't try to change. Churches in foreign countries must follow the worship styles and patterns of American churches. True or false? False. They should follow the patterns of what? The Bible, God's Word, right? But there's going to be differences, and sometimes they bother people. In Ireland, for example, we did not pass a collection plate. We didn't pass a collection plate. We had a collection, but we didn't pass a plate. It was just left. There was a little tray or something that you could leave if you had it. You could leave a donation in. But we would pray about it. It was part of the worship service, but it wasn't the way we do it here. And sometimes that would bother people. That was just the way they did it. So that's how we did it. In Pohnpei, you would probably have been very comfortable, most people would, in the way we did things in Pohnpei, but you might be sort of uncomfortable with how casual people were sometimes, Now in Pohnpei, we never wore ties, for example, but a lot of times the people there, they're very poor, so they just wore what they had on. That might be a Budweiser t-shirt. And we had people serve on the table with Budweiser t-shirts before because they didn't care. They didn't even know what it was. But it doesn't necessarily have to look American. In Pohnpei, we had a lot of visitors at church. We had people in the community. We had kids. We had chickens. We had a pig one time. We had dogs all the time coming in for worship. But, it doesn't always look the same way it looks here. Now, we do still have the same things, the Lord's Supper, preaching, giving, singing, praying, reading of Scripture. We do all those things, but we might not do them in the same order. We might do them in a different order, might do them in different ways. So that would not be correct. Just because it's not necessarily the way we do it doesn't mean it's wrong. Okay, a congregation must have a church building before it can be considered established. What do you think about that? No, not at all. Not at all. We can meet in people's homes. We can meet in the street. We can meet in the parking lot like they did at Jenks Avenue a few weeks ago, right? We would try, and I'll talk about this more again as we go on, we would try to start churches in Pohnpei in people's homes, but sometimes they were very uncomfortable with that. We'll talk about it later, just because of their hospitality, their way of thinking about bringing somebody into your home, because of their title system. So we would actually usually, we never would meet in somebody's home for any length of time. And I think Paraguay had that same issue, right? It was just different. Now, but they could meet in a hotel conference room or something like that, no problem. But in the home, that's where it would be. And we'll maybe get Troy to talk more about that when we get to it in our class. I think we're almost done. Adjusting back to your home culture is easy. What do you think? True or false, Troy? False. Even just visiting the home culture can be very difficult. It can be intimidating. The first time we came back from Pohnpei, we had not driven over like 30 miles an hour in 2 years. And we came back and had to drive on the interstate, and I was terrified. And I've been driving since before I was old enough to drive. My dad, I've told you this before, my parents were alcoholics, and I was their designated driver sometimes at 14. It's kind of a difficult thing, but on the interstate, we came back one time, and we woke up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. We had to go from Atlanta to Tennessee, to Knoxville, which is usually about a 4.5 hour drive, and it took us about 8 hours because I was just over in the right lane, just like a 100-year-old man. But I was terrified. I'll tell you one more thing. We'll talk about it again, but Pohnpei at that time, they had one grocery store basically, and that grocery store would normally have like one or two types of products. So they might have like 2 kinds of cereal or 2 kinds of chips. And so we went back to the States. We went to a super Walmart, and I said, I'm going to get some chips. I'm going to get me a snack. I can't wait. I couldn't wait. I was, oh, man, I'm getting in there. Got in the store, went in the chip aisle, and I just went, I couldn't believe it. I could not believe the selection. I was overwhelmed by it. And do you know I left that store without any chips? I couldn't decide. I just couldn't do it. Eventually, I got used to it. Now, Rebecca and I went back and forth enough that it's sort of an easy adjustment now. But the very first time, it's hard, and moving back here is hard. Now, for Troy, and I want y'all to just think about this for a minute, and Troy's been here right at a year, or no, Avalon's been gone right at a year, but you've been here almost a year and a half. Not only did Troy have to make a cultural shift coming back from 7 years in Paraguay, he had to make career shift in his mind. The work he does now is very different than what he did in Paraguay. And I appreciate this congregation for being patient with him. Now, not that you've needed to be. He does a great job. But sometimes if he does get flustered or something, which I've never seen him do yet, but if he does, just keep that in mind. It was a big shift. Yeah, sometimes he'll throw in a Spanish word there. You know what, though? When you learn another language, you miss it when you can't use it all the time. So I'm going to start. I'll do the next point in Pohnpei, and we'll see how that goes. No, just kidding. Okay, this is my favorite. When deciding which mission efforts to support, churches should always try to get the most bang for their buck. False, in my mind. You might think that. I have never in my life been so frustrated when I was in a missions meeting and somebody told me, we want to get the most bang for our buck. Well, what on earth does that even mean? Number one, and number two, and this was, sorry, now I'm going to get on my pedestal here. I've been told in meetings with people where I saw their financial statement and they had hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank, and I've been told, we can't support you, we can't afford to support you. And I've never gone to a meeting with an eldership where I wasn't sitting in a leather chair around a nice conference table and then they would tell me, we don't have enough money to support you. It can get very frustrating. But they want the most bang for their buck, and I guess chandeliers are the most bang for your buck. And so, sorry, I'm preaching now. I shouldn't do that, but we'll talk about it later. The easiest part of mission work is raising funds. False, very false. It's actually the hardest unless you're Troy Spradlin, and then you just fall into money. I'm just kidding. No, Troy is a good fundraiser. Yeah, it can be very, very difficult. In fact, I would say it's the most difficult part. However, again, we'll talk about this later. You're going to get sick of that phrase today, but I actually think there is sort of a design to it. If you can't get out and raise funds, then you probably don't need to go to the mission field. And also as a couple, now I don't know how Troy and Andrew were able to do it, but Rebecca and I, we started raising funds for our work in Pohnpei in 2004. We moved to Pohnpei in 2005. And I never went anywhere that Rebecca didn't come with me. And we would be on the road for weeks at a time, staying in people's homes, staying in hotels, just being in the car. And I'll tell you right now, that was such a huge testing ground, proving ground for our marriage. Because if we couldn't do that, I mean, you're living on, for us, a little bitty island that you can't get off of most of the time. If you can't survive in the car together for days at a time, then you don't need to go to the mission field. So there is some design to it, but it is very difficult. And we need to be sympathetic to people for that. Okay, so let's look at, yes, sir. Oh, I've never been to Jamaica. I was just using that as an example. Well, I mean, wherever they smoke marijuana. Yeah. Yeah, where I've never lived anywhere where it was a cultural thing. I was just coming up with an example off the top of my head. Yeah, that's right. I was blowing smoke, but not marijuana smoke. No, I am serious, though, that there is parts of that culture where they do smoke marijuana, but I don't know how. I wouldn't know. You'd have to ask somebody who had worked in that culture. I know in our experiences, we've always been able to participate in most everything they do in the culture, and the few things that we've not been able to, that's never been a big deal. Never been a problem. So let's do Bible, background, and authority for mission work. We'll get into this today, and then call it quits. Okay, so in our first true and false question, did we have something else? Oh, sorry. We asked about the whether or not mission or missionary was a biblical word. Here is the list of New Testament verses that contain the word mission, missions, or missionary, missionaries. That's it. That's the whole list right there. It's not found in the New Testament, in the English New Testament. So we're going to talk in a minute about whether or not we should use it, but it's not a Bible word necessarily. Now, if you want to be pedantic about it, really technical, you could say that there's no English word that's a Bible word because there's no inspired English translation. But there's, even in translations, I've never seen a translation with the word mission or missionaries. This is how we define it, though. Missionary, for Merriam-Webster, a person undertaking a mission, that makes sense, especially a religious mission, okay? Not super clear, but we get part of the idea. On Wikipedia, it says, a member of a religious group sent into an area to proselytize or perform ministries of service. That's how it's understood. And then dictionary.com says a person sent by a church into an area to carry on evangelism or other activities as educational or hospital work. And of course, it would be much broader than that, but that's just some examples they give. The idea of a missionary is somebody who is sent out. Now, this is actually even used in secular environments at times. Obviously, it's used in the military, though I've never heard a military person called a missionary, but they're sent off on missions. But the ambassador where we lived was called the chief of mission. He was the chief of the mission in Pohnpei. His assistant was the deputy chief of his or her. There was different ones. But the deputy chief of mission. So they've been sent as a representative for the American government. As a missionary, you are sent. The first, where does the word missionary come from then? If it's not from the Bible, where does it come from? From the Latin word mitto, I guess is how you would say that, meaning to send. And that's found in Luke 9 and verse 2. We'll talk about Luke 9 and verse 2 when we study mission work in the Bible. But just really quick, Luke 9 and verse 2 says, well, we'll look at verse 1. Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. So that's where that word comes from. Mitto, in the Latin translation of the Bible, right here where it says he sent, it says mitto, to send. And so you go from the Greek language, apostello, that's the Greek word in this verse. Then you go to the Latin language, mitto, and then you get to the anglicized version of mitto, which is missionary. That's where it comes from. So I guess you could say in the most, technically, it could be a Bible word, at least through Latin. Maybe it would be more biblical, though, to call me and Troy apostles. So that's how we want to be. No, I'm just kidding. The word apostle is a broader word than we generally let it be. But no, I would not want to take that terminology on. It was first used by Jesuits. Jesuits are a kind of Catholic priest. They're sort of like, the way I think of them as Catholic Special Forces. They're who we interacted with in Pohnpei. That's the priests that were there that we would talk to. By the way, I'm actually talking about Bible words. I'm misusing the word priest, aren't I? But that's just what we're familiar with. But there were Jesuits in Pohnpei, really nice guys, all the ones I met. They're usually very, very educated. They normally speak many languages, but they were the first ones to use that word. Now, of course, they're educated. Maybe they're a little too educated because they don't preach the truth of God's word, but that's where that word first became used. A more biblical word would probably be evangelist. In Acts chapter 21, verse 8, we see Paul and his companions, including Luke. Notice what it says here. Acts 21, verse 8. On the next day, we who were Paul's companions, so obviously Luke would be included with that, departed and came to Caesarea and entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. That's the first time you find this word used in the Bible. In Ephesians 4, verse 11, you have a list of inspired offices of the New Testament, and he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers. So you have 5 people listed there: apostles, prophets, evangelists, and then it's either pastors and teachers or pastors/teachers. There's some debate about which one it should be. But of those 5, so let's look at it: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, how many of those 5 do we still have today? Would you say? Do we have apostles today? No. Do we have prophets today? No. Do we have evangelists today? Yes. Yeah, and they usually make a profit, too. We have evangelists, so that's one of them. Do we have pastors today? Yes, we do. Are there pastors in this church? Yes, there are. We don't use that term the way the denominational world uses it, but that's what our elders are. And then do we have teachers today? Yes, so we have 3 out of the 5. Now, the difference would be these would all be probably endowed with miraculous powers, whereas today we are not. Okay? But you have that. And then over in 2 Timothy chapter 4 in verse 5, you have Paul in his encouragement of Timothy. He says, "You be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry." Okay, evangelist comes from the same root word that the word gospel comes from, the word good news. Euangelion is the word, or I think that's correct. Troy, is that correct? Yes. And the word evangelist actually means one who preaches the good news. A definition I've seen is one who brings glad tidings of good things. Okay? So that would probably be the more biblical word to use, but I don't go around telling people I'm an evangelist. I'm a foreign evangelist, because if I did, they'd say, what on earth does that mean? I just tell people I'm a missionary. Now, when we were in Ireland, we did not say that. In Pohnpei, we did, because they're used to that. In Ireland, they're not. They would say, we don't need missionaries. What are you doing here? So I would just say I'm a minister, usually, is how I would say that. Because it would actually be almost offensive to them to think that they needed missionaries. It was kind of a weird cultural difference. So we would just say we were ministers there. On our website, the Margaret Street website, it calls us a missionary. I have no problem with that, because it's just the normal word we use. And I know there are some people who, a good friend of mine in Troy down in Palm Beach Lakes, a guy named Joe, he likes to say, we speak where the Bible speaks, we're silent where the Bible is silent, we call Bible things by Bible names. And I would agree with that most of the time, but we do use different terminology that's just sort of accepted. And by the way, Joe would call me a missionary, so he would, even though that's not a Bible name technically. But I don't have any problem with using that word. If you do, you can talk to me about it later, but I don't think anybody would either, just because it's a normal word. We misuse the word church all the time. Even I know we're not going to church today, but if somebody asked me yesterday, what are you doing tomorrow, I would say I'm going to church. Now, I try to say I'm going to worship. I try to say church building, not just the church. But I forget sometimes and just use it the common way. I just misuse the word priest. Let me just take a quick poll here. How many people today, raise your hand if you talked to a priest today? Raise your hand. See, a few of you knew what I was getting at, but a lot of you are like, no, I didn't, because you didn't talk to a Catholic priest. But you did. Everyone in this room has talked to a priest today, because if you're a Christian, you're a priest. Okay? But we misuse that word all the time. So I don't think it's a misuse of the word missionary, and I don't have a problem with using it. I've probably wasted enough time on that. The concept of missions is definitely in the Bible, right? If we take missions as sending, then it is definitely in the Bible. You are probably well familiar with these verses, Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Mark's, good job, Scott. Way to proofread. Mark's 16, 15, and 16. That's meant to be apostrophe S, I guess, Mark's gospel account. And Acts 1, verse 8. Acts 1, verse 8 might be the one that you're not super familiar with. Matthew 28, verse 18 through 20. Jesus said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Amen. My father-in-law does not fly. And the reason he doesn't fly is because Jesus said, lo, I am with you always. Up high, I'm not with, no. He actually, this is, for those of you, some of you are grandparents, some of you have parents who are grandparents. My father-in-law doesn't fly. He does not like to fly. He's very, very anxious about it. And I invited him when Rebecca turned 30. We were in Pompeii. Now, Rebecca just turned 30 yesterday. She's just one day over 30 all the time. No, but this is, when she turned 30, I called her dad. I said, listen, I know you don't like to fly, but I'm willing to surprise Rebecca for her 30th birthday. I am willing to pay. It's a very expensive flight. I will pay for you and Diane, his wife, to come to Pompeii to surprise Rebecca for her 30th birthday. And he said, no. He said, it's not that I don't like to fly, I will not fly. He said, if there was a bridge that went to Pompeii, I would drive over it, but I'm not flying. Okay, fast forward a little while. Violet is born. Speaking of, Violet is intimidated by a memory class. But anyway, Violet is born a few years later. Guess who gets on an airplane and comes all the way to Pompeii? This guy who doesn't fly. Grandpa, grandchildren are very powerful motivators, apparently. All right. Anyway, that has nothing to do with our class. Mark 16:15-16, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. He who does not believe will be condemned. Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. So here Jesus is sending people, okay? He has sent them out, and he sends us out as well. I think we have about 3 minutes, and I think we're going to do it. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 through 8. You could actually make the argument that Jesus himself was a missionary, right? Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of man. So you could make that argument that Jesus was the first one ever sent. You have Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 42. Jesus sending the apostles out 2 by 2. Luke 9, verses 1 through 6, the exact same account, but just in Luke's perspective. And then you have Luke 10, where Jesus sends the 70, or some people say 72. But there was these different occasions where Jesus sent people out. But you even have mission work in the Old Testament, right? We talked about that last week. Who was sent to Nineveh to preach to it? Jonah. That's right. He was sent on a mission. And then Nahum would have been after him. After Jonah, after they repented, they went back into their sin, and then Nahum was sent to them. You might not know this, but Obadiah was a missionary. Obadiah did not preach to Israel. He preached to Edom. Isaiah preached to foreign kings all the time. So that mission work as a biblical concept goes much, I think that's it for our slides, goes much earlier and beyond the New Testament. Now, what we'll talk about next week, we'll look at different examples of New Testament missions. Mostly, we will look at Paul and Barnabas. I have not heard a bell. But according to my clock, we're just about out of time. We'll concentrate mostly on Paul and Barnabas, but we'll also look at Philip. Philip was sent to Samaria and preached the gospel there. Philip was sent to one man. He was sent on a mission journey for one man. Do you know who that one man was? I think I heard it. The Ethiopian eunuch. He was sent to him on a mission. And so we'll talk about that next week. Look at some of the different things that go along with that. Any questions before we close? All right, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to teaching this class. I hope you look forward to taking it, and we'll try to make it as informative as possible. We're dismissed now, and we'll worship with you here in just a few minutes. No, thank you.
In there's